The post-war order was never just about power, it was about rules, and the institutions built to keep them. NATO, the UN, the WTO, the WHO, they gave structure to a chaotic world, grounded not just in American strength but American steadiness. But over the last 2 decades, U.S. support for those systems has wavered. And when the architect questions the foundation, the whole structure begins to shift. This is the story of how multilateralism became optional and what broke when America stepped back.
Imagine the world order built after World War II, with the U.S. helping architect cornerstone global institutions. Think the UN, the systems that became the WTO, the roots of NATO.
Right, these huge pillars.
They were meant to be enduring. But what a quarter century reveals is a relationship that has gotten, undeniably complicated. Since 2000, we've seen the U.S. swing pretty dramatically between periods of engagement and then, significant moments of stepping back.
And that swing is really the heart of this, isn't it? We're asking. How has the U.S. approach to these major international organizations fundamentally changed over the past 25 years?
Yeah, and what does that tell us?
What does it tell us not just about shifts in American foreign policy, but about the wider impact on the global stage?
To really dig into this, we've pulled together quite a stack of material. A detailed timeline, reviews covering U.S. interaction with specific players like the WTO, the WHO, NATO, various UN bodies.
Plus arms control, climate.
Right. Arms control treaties, climate accords, even shifts in foreign aid. We're drawing on everything from official government documents, news archives, to analysis looking at this period from roughly 2000 right up to early 2025.
Our mission really is to take all this information and distill the most important insights for you. We want to highlight the key policy shifts, explore the stated reasons different administrations gave for these changes,
whether they were leaning in or pulling back,
and examine the consequences. The goal is for you to walk away with a much clearer picture of this dynamic, sometimes turbulent relationship between the U.S. and the institutions it helped create.
And why does this matter to you? Because these organizations and the level of U.S. involvement, they aren't just abstract concepts, are they?
Not at all.
They influence the global trade rules that affect your job or the products you buy, the international health systems fighting pandemics, the security alliances aiming to prevent conflicts, and, the collective efforts on huge challenges like climate change.
Understanding this evolution helps you understand some of the fundamental forces shaping the world we live in today.
So as we begin, the material immediately flags this core, persistent tension. It seems to underpin so much of the U.S. approach.
Yeah, it's this continuous balancing act, isn't it? On one hand, you've got the recognition that leveraging these institutions can advance U.S. interests.
Makes sense.
But on the other hand, there's this suspicion, this view of them as potential constraints on U.S. sovereignty, on its freedom of action.
And that tension seems to directly lead to the different strategies the U.S. has used when it wants to change its relationship, right? The sources talk about things like formal withdrawals.
Yep, pulling out of treaties or organizations entirely.
Or significant cuts, even withholding funding altogether, and public efforts to, what's the term they use, delegitimize them.
That's the one, delegitimize.
Can you break that down? What does that actually involve?
It's a fascinating concept in the material because it's more than just disagreeing. Delegitimization, as the sources portray, involves using both rhetoric, sharp public criticism, questioning an institution's authority or motives, alleging bias, corruption, and concrete actions like cutting funds or withdrawing, all aimed at undermining the perception that the institution has rightful authority to act or set norms.
So it's about chipping away at their standing.
And these actions can be strategic, sometimes intended to force reforms, or maybe they just flow from broader shifts in foreign policy philosophy.
And the official justifications, the reasons given for these moves, often seem to fall into some familiar buckets, don't they?
They do. Concerns over national sovereignty come up a lot, especially with legal frameworks or agreements seen as potentially infringing on U.S. law or autonomy.
Right.
Then there are economic arguments, fairness of funding burdens, the impact of regulations on U.S. industries.
We hear that one often.
And then, as you mentioned, critiques of the institutions themselves, questions about their effectiveness, or specific accusations of bias.
And we see these themes playing out consistently, though maybe with different emphasis, across the 4 administrations we're covering here. George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, leading us up to the actions noted in early 2025.
Each administration brought its own priorities. resulting in this mix of continuity, selective engagement, and sometimes really sharp policy reversals.
Speaking of reversals, let's dive into the UN system first.
Okay.
Looking across the material, it's clear the U.S. approach here has been, well, far from uniform.
Oh, definitely not. It's really a mixed bag, isn't it? Engagement here, strategic retreat there, depending on the specific UN body.
It shows the relationship isn't monolithic.
Right. The U.S. treats different parts of the UN very differently, often reflecting specific domestic political fights or, evolving geopolitical concerns.
Let's start with the World Health Organization, the WHO. What does the history show there?
Well, in the early 2000s, under President Bush, the U.S. was engaged, sure, but the WHO wasn't typically, front page news.
Right.
There was some, let's say, ideological reservations, particularly from Republicans, often linked to issues around reproductive health funding connected to other UN agencies.
Okay.
President Obama continued this support, and the WHO remained relatively low profile in U.S. foreign policy during his time.
And then came the big shift under the Trump administration.
This is where the WHO moved center stage, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic. President Trump announced the first formal U.S. withdrawal from the WHO in July 2020. The stated reasons were its handling of the pandemic, allegations of undue influence from China. The withdrawal was set for July 2021.
And that cut off collaboration.
It did. Even things like joint work between the CDC and WHO staff. The material kind of frames this action, especially during the pandemic's height, as well as scapegoating. And U.S. public opinion on the WHO becomes starkly partisan. Democrats largely favorable, Republicans largely unfavorable.
But then a rapid turnaround under President Biden.
Immediate. Literally on his first day, January 20, 2021, President Biden reversed that withdrawal.
Wow, day one.
Day one. The U.S. quickly resumed funding, paid around $200 million in arrears, significantly increased contributions in 2022-23, restored its position as the top funder.
Back in the game.
Fully back. Re-engaged deeply in WHO governance, active in talks for a potential pandemic treaty, revising the international health regulations, coordinated extensively on the COVID response, COVAX, vaccine donations.
They also pushed for more transparency on COVID origins, but worked within the WHO framework for that, right?
Precisely. The underlying philosophy under Biden, as described, was this clear link. Global health security equals U.S. national security.
Makes sense.
Public opinion did rebound somewhat, but that partisan split from the Trump era, it largely persisted.
Which brings us to early 2025 and, another announced withdrawal.
Yes, the pattern repeats. On January 20, 2025, President Trump, starting his second term, announced a second withdrawal from the WHO.
Same reasons.
Pretty much echoed the previous ones. Mismanagement, alleged corruption, perceived unfair financial burden on the U.S. compared to others, again singling out China.
This sequence really highlights the policy whiplash.
It does, and how the WHO became this highly politicized partisan symbol in the U.S.
It makes you wonder about the long-term impact on global health efforts if U.S. commitment is so vulnerable to domestic political cycles.
That's a major implication, right? It creates huge uncertainty for funding, for coordination on global health challenges that need consistent, long-term international cooperation.
And moving on within the UN, what about the UN Human Rights Council, the UNHRC?
Yes. The U.S. relationship here began with skepticism right from the start, when the council was created in 2006 under President Bush.
How so?
The U.S. chose not to be a founding member. They cited concerns about including countries with poor human rights records and, significantly, a perceived anti-Israel bias.
But Obama eventually re-engaged.
He did. However, fast forward to 2018, and the Trump administration withdrew entirely.
Pulled out completely.
Completely. The rationale given by the administration, including then UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, was that the council was hypocritical and self-serving, showed unending hostility towards Israel.
Same themes again?
Yep, highlighting the presence of member states seen as human rights violators. This was the first time the U.S. had ever quit the body. Human rights groups at the time warned it would undermine global accountability efforts.
And President Biden re-engaged again.
Yes, during his term, the U.S. returned. But echoing that WHO pattern, early 2025 brought another reversal.
Another withdrawal.
A second withdrawal announced in February 2025 under President Trump. The actions noted were terminating U.S. participation, ending efforts to get elected to the council, closing the U.S. rep office for the UNHRC.
Wow.
And formally announcing they'd withhold the portion of the U.S.'s UN budget assessment meant for the UNHRC.
And the stated reasons were consistent with the past.
Very much so. Persistent anti-Israel bias, concerns about abusive regimes being members, the view that the Council lacked credibility. This sequence clearly illustrates what the sources call selective multilateralism, meaning U.S. engagement is heavily swayed by its strategic priorities here, protecting key allies like Israel and using critiques of the institution's membership or actions as a tactic to, well, delegitimize it.
Let's turn to UNESCO, the UN Agency for Education, Science, and Culture. This one has a history of U.S. back and forth even before our 2000 timeframe, right?
That's right. The U.S. had actually withdrawn way back in 1984, but under President Bush, the U.S. rejoined in 2002.
Why rejoin then?
They cited reforms within UNESCO, alignment with U.S. values like press freedom, education for all. This reentry even had bipartisan support, including from then Senator Joe Biden.
But funding became an issue under Obama.
It did. After Palestine was admitted as a full member in 2011, U.S. law kicked in, triggering restrictions that prevented the U.S. from paying its dues. That led to significant accumulated arrears.
Which kind of set the stage for another withdrawal.
Precisely. In 2017, the Trump administration announced withdrawal, effective 2018. The stated reasons: those mounting arrears, alleged anti-Israel bias again, and perceived failure to reform. They explicitly acknowledged the funding impasse from 2011 was a factor.
President Biden rejoined in 2023.
Yes, in July 2023, restoring full U.S. membership and engagement.
And for 2025, any news?
The sources note that in February 2025, the White House under President Trump ordered a review of U.S. membership in UNESCO, 90 days to complete it.
What's the review looking for?
Specifically tasked with assessing if UNESCO aligns with U.S. interests and examining any instances of anti-Semitism or anti-Israel bias.
So we see this recurring cycle tied to concerns about Palestine's status and perceived bias, with U.S. financial contributions often used as leverage or getting tangled up in these political issues.
It shows how funding isn't just about resources. It can become a political tool to signal dissatisfaction or try to steer an organization, which, can really disrupt the cooperative nature of these bodies.
Let's talk about UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. This agency has faced some major U.S. funding disruptions.
Yes, under the Trump administration, funding to UNRWA was cut off in 2018.
The reasons given.
Stated reasons cited concerns about the agency's effectiveness, its neutrality, and potential diversion of aid resources.
President Biden restored that funding.
He did. However, then came the allegations in January 2024 about some UNRWA staff involvement in the October 7th attacks.
Right.
The Biden administration announced a temporary pause in funding then. This was reinforced in March 2024 when Congress passed legislation that explicitly prohibited U.S. funding to UNRWA until March 2025.
Did other international donors follow suit?
Many paused initially, but the material indicates most resumed funding, largely due to the severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza and assurances from UNRWA about their vetting processes.
And investigations followed?
Yes. An independent review and a UN investigation reportedly found insufficient evidence for most of the staff initially implicated, though the material mentions 9 staff members were terminated by UNRWA itself.
And the Biden administration had even stated, according to the sources, that UNRWA's role in Gaza cannot be filled by anyone else. That sounds pretty essential.
Yes, reportedly stating that back in October 2024, underlining the agency's critical, maybe indispensable role in humanitarian aid there.
But the policy shifted again in early 2025.
It did. In February 2025, President Trump issued an executive order prohibiting any U.S. funds for UNRWA, formally reversing the prior administration's funding determination. The U.S. also notified the UN and UNRWA no funding for 2025 assessments or any prior arrears.
Wow. What this history seems to show is how deeply humanitarian aid can get tangled up, instrumentalized within a really sensitive geopolitical conflict.
It really does.
I mean, the decision potentially cuts off aid for millions based on allegations against a tiny fraction of staff. You said 9 confirmed terminations out of maybe 30,000 employees.
That's what the source material indicates. It raises questions about balancing legitimate security concerns with the humanitarian imperative, and how U.S. policy here can be so heavily influenced by geopolitics and domestic politics, potentially at the cost of aid delivery.
And it highlights potential contradictions within the U.S. government itself.
Between Congress or the White House, and statements from parts of the administration about UNRWA's indispensable role.
Okay, finally, within the UN system, the UNFPA, the UN Population Fund, has also seen a pattern of U.S. funding cuts.
This is a really clear example, noted in the sources, of how domestic U.S. ideological debates, specifically around reproductive rights, directly hit foreign policy and international aid.
How so?
Republican administrations, including President Bush's, have repeatedly cut UNFPA funding based on something called the Kemp-Kasten Amendment.
What's that?
It links funding to allegations that the agency supports or participates in coercive abortion or sterilization programs, often referencing activities in China, whether there's evidence or not.
President Obama restored the funding.
He did. And President Trump announced an end to funding again in March 2025, citing Kemp-Kasten and the same alleged coercive practices.
And this had real-world impact.
Oh, yes. The material confirms a cut of $377 million to USAID grants impacting vital maternal health and family planning services globally was announced in February 2025 as a result.
And UNFPA and advocates warned of harm.
They did, warning of devastating impacts on health outcomes. The claims about UNFPA supporting coercive practices have been consistently refuted. A prior State Department memo reportedly found no evidence.
So this pattern really illustrates how U.S. funding for essential international health services can be turned on or off, almost unpredictably.
Based on shifting domestic political agendas, undermining the reliability of U.S. support for global health, regardless of the agency's actual work or the needs on the ground.
That's a comprehensive look at the UN system. Let's shift gears now to arms control. This is an area where the U.S. has taken some pretty big steps to, well, dismantle foundational treaties.
Yeah, this area shows a different set of drivers, things like shifting threat perceptions, prioritizing strategic flexibility, sometimes leading to the collapse of long-standing agreements with pretty significant global repercussions.
Let's start with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty. Big one.
Huge one. Signed back in '72, limited defenses against strategic ballistic missiles, basically underpinning the whole mutually assured destruction, or MAD, doctrine.
Right.
In December 2001, President Bush announced the U.S. intent to withdraw, and it became effective June 2002. The stated rationale: the treaty was outdated post-Cold War, hindered developing missile defenses needed against rogue states and terrorists after 9/11. MAD, they argued, wasn't the necessary foundation anymore.
What were the global impacts of withdrawing from such a cornerstone treaty?
Well, Russia's initial reaction was somewhat muted, but many analysts, according to the sources, believe the withdrawal significantly fueled new arms races down the line.
Awesome.
Russia, for instance, later explicitly linked its development of new offensive missile systems to the end of the ABM treaty. China reportedly sped up its missile programs, developing multi-warheads. It also rendered a previous U.S.-Russia agreement on missile defense demarcation pretty much moot.
So aiming for greater security and flexibility might have, maybe inadvertently, created more instability.
That's the argument presented in the material, that this was an act of preemptive unilateralism, prioritizing perceived strategic flexibility based on anticipated future threats over maintaining a long-standing arms control framework, and that it ultimately contributed to a less predictable strategic landscape globally. A classic security dilemma, perhaps.
Next up, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty.
Right, this one from 1987 eliminated ground-launched missiles with ranges between 500 and 500 kilometers. Under President Trump, the U.S. announced intent to withdraw in October 2018, suspended obligations Feb 2019, and formally exited August 2019.
Stated reasons.
Two main ones: Russia's alleged non-compliance, specifically regarding their Novator and 9M729 missile, and the need for the U.S. to counter China's growing arsenal of intermediate-range missiles, since China wasn't party to this bilateral U.S.-Russia deal.
And the consequences of leaving that one.
Russia immediately suspended its participation too. The withdrawal essentially freed both countries to develop and deploy weapons that were previously banned. It really highlighted a key challenge for bilateral treaties in a world where other major powers, like China, have the very capabilities to treaty limits. It also underscored a breakdown of trust and, perceived failure of verification withdrawal was chosen over trying to resolve compliance issues within the treaty framework itself.
And finally, the Treaty on Open Skies. What was that one about?
This 1992 treaty allowed signatory countries to conduct unarmed surveillance flights over each other's territory. It was meant to build confidence and transparency. President Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal in May 2020, effective November 2020. Stated reasons included alleged long-standing Russian violations like flight limits over Kaliningrad or near Georgia, and concerns Russia was using the flights to gather intel on the U.S. infrastructure.
This action directly prompted Russia's withdrawal too.
It did. Russia formally withdrew in December 2021, citing the U.S. exit and claiming other members couldn't guarantee data wouldn't be shared with the U.S. Ukraine opposed the U.S. withdrawal, highlighting the treaty's value to them.
Did the Biden administration try to get back in?
No, significantly, they did not seek to re-enter this treaty. This sequence really shows how one major power leaving can unravel a whole multilateral arrangement. And again, compliance disputes were used as the rationale for exiting an agreement deemed no longer strategically beneficial.
Okay, let's shift gears again. Climate change and environmental agreements, another area that's seen, well, significant ups and downs in U.S. commitment.
Yes, this area is particularly sensitive to domestic political divisions and these ongoing debates about economic competitiveness and global burden sharing.
Starting with the Kyoto Protocol.
The U.S., under President Clinton, signed Kyoto in 1998, but never actually sent it to the Senate for ratification.
Why not?
Largely because the Senate had already passed the Byrd-Hagel resolution 95-0 in 1997. It basically said the U.S. shouldn't be bound by a climate deal unless it also required commitments from major developing countries like China and India, which Kyoto didn't.
So the writing was on the wall.
Pretty much. Then, in 2001, President Bush formally repudiated the protocol, calling it unfair and ineffective. Concerns about harming the U.S. economy, competitiveness fueled by industry lobbying were also major stated factors.
So domestic political constraints were really the primary driver there.
That near-unanimous Senate opposition effectively blocked ratification. The U.S. rejection significantly weakened the agreement. The U.S. was the biggest emitter then, and it really complicated international climate talks for years.
And it pushed the U.S. towards other methods.
Yeah, it contributed to a U.S. preference for using executive agreements in international environmental policy, trying to bypass that whole Senate ratification hurdle.
The Paris Agreement offers an even more dramatic example of this policy whiplash, doesn't it?
Oh, it really does, a textbook case. The U.S. played a role under President Obama in negotiating Paris, formally joined in 2016 through executive action.
Then Trump.
Then President Trump announced the intention to withdraw in June 2017. The process initiated withdrawal became effective November 4, 2020. At that exact moment, the U.S. was the only country on Earth outside the agreement.
And President Biden rejoined immediately.
Yes, true to his campaign promise, initiated the process on day one, January 20th, 2021. The U.S. officially became a party again 30 days later.
But the material indicates another withdrawal announcement in early 2025.
That's correct. On January 20, 2025, President Trump issued an executive order directing a second withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. The stated effective date is January 27, 2026. That's 1 year after the required notification to the UN, per the agreement's rules. The stated reasons for both Trump withdrawals have been pretty consistent.
Let me guess. Unfair burden.
Unfair burden on U.S. industries, especially energy sectors. Too much flexibility for developing countries like China, India, economic harm, America first.
What are the impacts of the U.S. repeatedly entering and leaving such a central climate accord like this? It must be disruptive.
Hugely disruptive. The first withdrawal did spur some other countries to maybe increase their own climate ambitions, sort of stepping into the gap.
Okay.
But there are widespread concerns that U.S. disengagement significantly delays the global emissions cuts needed to meet temperature targets. As of April 2025, no other country had followed the U.S. out after the second announcement. But the U.S. action weakens global coordination, diminishes U.S. leadership.
And the instability undermines confidence.
Severely. Confidence in the durability of U.S. climate commitments. It reflects prioritizing short-term domestic economic concerns, as perceived by the administration, over long-term global stability, driven by that nationalist perspective.
Linked closely to international climate action is the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. How did that fare?
Yes, another area directly hit by these U.S. policy swings. President Obama pledged $3 billion, delivered $1 billion before leaving office.
Okay.
President Biden later pledged an additional $3 billion in 2023 and delivered $1 billion of that.
Leaving a remaining pledge of $4 billion outstanding.
Precisely. And the material notes that on January 27, 2025, President Trump rescinded those outstanding $4 billion in pledged contributions.
Just
Canceled them. This action is explicitly tied in the sources to the broader realignment of U.S. climate policy under the new administration, including the Paris Withdrawal Plan. An executive order on January 20th also broadly sought to limit U.S. financial contributions for climate mitigation and adaptation projects abroad.
How does rescinding a $4 billion pledge impact the GCF? That sounds like a lot.
It's significant. It impacts the fund's overall capacity to support projects. Estimates suggest it could reduce GCF available funding by maybe 20%.
That directly affects projects in developing nations.
Adaptation projects, renewable energy investments. It signals a clear shift in U.S. climate diplomacy, raises questions about collective financial capacity, and failing to deliver on pledges this big really erodes trust between developed and developing countries, making future agreements much harder.
Is there any international environmental fund where the U.S. has shown consistent support through all this?
The Global Environment Facility, the GEF, actually stands out as an exception in the material.
Oh,
Yeah, the U.S. has been a pretty consistent, often leading supporter since the GEF started in 1991. For the most recent funding cycle, 2022-2026, the U.S. made its largest pledge ever, over $600 million.
and no withdrawals or cuts noted.
The sources don't indicate any specific withdrawal or withholding for the GEF up to early 2025. U.S. support there is cited as aligning with a broader range of U.S. priorities: climate, yes, but also biodiversity, ocean health, combating pollutants.
That's interesting. It suggests maybe some institutions are more resilient to these political swings.
It does seem that way. The GEF's broader mandate, covering multiple environmental issues beyond just climate, might give it more resilience, maybe broader bipartisan support compared to the more climate-specific funds that have become so politicized.
Maybe effective institutions with direct co-benefits are more insulated.
That could be part of it. However, the material does caution that the sweeping foreign aid freezes announced in early 2025 could potentially pose a future risk even to funds like the GEF if overall foreign assistance gets dramatically cut or reprioritized across the board.
Right. Let's turn now to international legal and justice frameworks. This is another area where the U.S. has shown significant, contestation and sometimes outright opposition.
Yeah, this is where those concerns about national sovereignty, especially regarding potential jurisdiction over U.S. citizens or actions, really become a central driver of U.S. policy and resistance.
Starting with the International Criminal Court, the ICC. That relationship has been rocky.
Complex and, at times, definitely adversarial. President Clinton signed the Rome Statute, the treaty establishing the ICC, back in 2000, but didn't send it for Senate ratification. Kind of wanted to wait and see.
Okay.
Under President Bush, though, the U.S. took a path of active opposition. In 2002, it formally unsigned. The Rome Statute basically took back its signature.
Unsigned. That's unusual.
It is. That same year, Congress passed the American Service Members Protection Act, ASPA nicknamed the Hague Invasion Act.
I've heard of that.
It authorized the president to use all means necessary to free U.S. or allied personnel detained by the ICC. It also prohibited military aid to countries party to the Rome Statute unless they signed bilateral immunity agreements, BIAs, promising not to surrender U.S. citizens to the ICC.
So actively working against the court.
Very actively. Plus seeking exemptions for U.S. peacekeepers through the UN Security Council.
President Obama shifted to a more engaged approach, though.
Yes, a policy termed positive engagement. Sending observers to ICC proceedings, offering support for specific investigations. It was a significant shift towards more cooperation.
But under Trump, the strong opposition returned.
It did, with force. President Trump criticized the ICC at the UN in 2018, anticipating a potential ICC investigation into actions in Afghanistan involving U.S. personnel. His administration revoked the ICC prosecutor's U.S. visa in 2019.
Took away her visa.
Yep. And in June 2020, authorized sanctions against ICC officials involved in such investigations.
President Biden lifted those sanctions.
He did in April 2021. However, the Biden administration maintained that longstanding U.S. objection to the ICC, asserting jurisdiction over nationals of non-party countries like the U.S. and Israel.
That position remained firm.
Yes. Highlighted again in May 2024 when the U.S. opposed the ICC prosecutor's request for arrest warrants for Israeli officials.
And then, in early 2025, another turn.
The material notes that in February 2025, under the second Trump administration, an executive order imposed new sanctions on the ICC.
So it seems the core U.S. objections have really persisted across administrations, even if the tactics change.
The core stated reasons remain fundamentally about sovereignty and jurisdiction. Deep concerns U.S. citizens' military officials could face politically motivated or unfair prosecutions.
In constitutional arguments.
Yes, arguments that the ICC violates the U.S. Constitution, not an Article III court, no Bill of Rights guarantees. The U.S. position views submitting to ICC jurisdiction as an unacceptable surrender of sovereignty. President Trump explicitly said the ICC had no jurisdiction, no legitimacy, and no authority over U.S. citizens.
And it's often linked to investigations targeting allies like Israel.
Clearly linked. And the U.S. has sometimes framed these legal challenges as lawfare, using legal systems strategically against it.
It raises a significant question about the U.S.'s commitment to international justice when it takes such active steps. ASPA, BIAs, specifically designed to shield its people and undermine the court.
It does. ASPA and the BIA push were deliberate efforts to counteract the ICC's principle of universal jurisdiction regarding U.S. nationals. While the stance fluctuated between hostility and cautious non-cooperation, that consistent concern about sovereignty and jurisdiction over its citizens remains a powerful driver, leading to active measures to delegitimize and shield.
What about the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, the World Court? Did the U.S. engage with or withdraw from mechanisms related to it?
Yes, the U.S. has withdrawn from certain parts of the ICJ's jurisdiction, specifically optional protocols attached to major treaties.
Like what?
In 2005, under President Bush, the U.S. withdrew from the optional protocol to the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations concerning compulsory settlement of disputes.
What did that protocol do?
It allowed countries to bring disputes over the Consular Relations Convention to the ICJ. The U.S. withdrawal was a direct response to adverse ICJ rulings against it, particularly cases involving foreign nationals on death row in the U.S. who hadn't been given their consular rights. The Avena case by Mexico is a key example.
And under President Trump, there was another withdrawal from an optional protocol.
Correct. In 2018, the U.S. withdrew from the optional protocol to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations concerning compulsory settlement of disputes. This one allows disputes over the Diplomatic Relations Convention to go to the ICJ.
And the trigger for that one?
It followed Palestine filing a case at the ICJ challenging the U.S. decision to move its embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. The U.S. stated it didn't recognize responsibilities under the Diplomatic Relations Convention regarding Palestinians in this context, and thus didn't accept the ICJ's jurisdiction via the protocol.
So these were essentially reactive withdrawals, wouldn't you say?
That's the pattern observed in the material, yes. Reacting by pulling out of these specific protocols when faced with adverse rulings or legal challenges related to U.S. domestic practices or sensitive foreign policy.
What are the implications?
Well, Amnesty International warned the VCCR protocol withdrawal undermined the convention itself, endangered foreigners' rights. These moves fueled charges of unilateralism, questioned U.S. commitment to comply with treaty obligations when faced with unfavorable interpretations.
So it insulates the U.S. legally.
From future suits under these protocols, yes. But it also means the U.S. loses the ability to sue others under them. It arguably weakens the treaty regimes by removing key avenues for interpretation and enforcement through the ICJ.
Let's move to U.S. foreign aid and development, an area that, according to the sources, saw particularly dramatic and sweeping actions in early 2025.
Yes, this segment describes actions that represent a really profound potential shift in the U.S. approach to global development and humanitarian assistance.
Let's start with USAID, the main U.S. agency for international development. What happened there in early 2025?
The sources describe an executive order from President Trump imposing a freeze on all U.S. foreign aid globally, a 90-day review period.
All aid frozen.
All aid. Paused new funding obligations, disbursements, mandated stop work orders on current awards with only very limited waivers. A formal notification went to Congress outlining intent to review U.S. aid to maximize efficiency and align operations with the national interest.
And the review could lead to?
Explicitly stated it could consider suspending or eliminating entire programs, country missions, potentially reorganizing or downsizing the agency itself. The material even notes the USAID HQ building was reportedly closed temporarily, many staff put on administrative leave.
And the scale of the program cancellations was immense.
It sounds like it. By March 2025, the State Department reportedly announced over 80% of USAID's programs worldwide had been canceled.
80%.
That's the figure cited. The material gives examples like Johns Hopkins University losing over $800 million in grants, over 2,200 jobs lost. Some sources quoted refer to it as effectively having shut down USAID globally.
The stated reasons for these drastic steps were quite broad, though. Efficiency, national interest.
Yes, framed broadly. Realign aid with American values, the national interest, maximize efficiency. The sources characterize this as a sweeping overhaul driven more by an ideological agenda than targeted reform, prioritizing this ideological realignment over program continuity, effectiveness, or humanitarian consequences.
And the impact on people around the world must have been immediate.
The freeze and cancellations halted critical programs, healthcare, food, shelter, humanitarian support. Specific examples mentioned: ending TB research, malaria programs in Tanzania, maternal health in Nigeria and Afghanistan, diarrhea programs in Bangladesh, HIV/AIDS in India and Africa.
Were there legal challenges?
Yes, challenges were filed. Courts issued temporary restraining orders in some cases, but by then the programs had reportedly already been terminated. Amnesty International has cited warning the cuts were reckless and profoundly damaging, placing millions at risk, potentially violating rights. Observers noted it fractured the International Humanitarian Support Foundation.
It also sounds like it risks just dismantling decades of built-up expertise and established programs overnight.
And it severely damages U.S. soft power, its reputation as a reliable partner in development and crisis response.
Beyond the specific USAID actions, the sources also mention broader foreign aid freezes and reviews affecting everything.
Yes, that early 2025 executive order froze all U.S. foreign assistance for that initial 90-day review. While USAID saw the most dramatic actions detailed, the Trump administration had previously, in its first term, proposed significant overall foreign aid budget cuts.
Right.
And the stated focus on promoting fossil fuels also implied a potential shift away from funding climate aid, which aligns with canceling those GCF pledges we discussed.
And the justification for these broader actions again came back to assessing alignment with American values and U.S. national interests.
Consistent with an America First perspective that tends to view international contributions, including aid, as potentially burdensome or ineffective, unless they offer a clear, direct U.S. benefit or meet specific ideological criteria.
The potential impacts mentioned in the material sound dire.
Legal challenges question the constitutionality of such broad freezes. UN officials, humanitarian organizations, reportedly warned that abrupt, deep cuts risk increasing global instability, potentially undermining efforts against terrorism and transnational threats by worsening the root causes: poverty, lack of opportunity.
And the human cost estimates.
Estimates drawn from the USAID shutdown context suggested millions of children could lose education access, millions lose health care, potentially leading to millions of preventable deaths annually.
This really raises that question about whether these short-term cuts may be driven by domestic political promises or signaling spending shifts, are actually counterproductive to the U.S.'s own long-term strategic interest in global stability.
That's precisely the argument presented in the sources. Treating foreign aid as just discretionary spending overlooks its role as a foreign policy tool, a security tool. The material highlights the apparent contradiction, stating goals like promoting global stability while taking actions like drastic aid cuts that could foreseeably increase instability. The argument is that such short-term austerity could be severely counterproductive long-term.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground. UN, arms control, climate, legal frameworks, aid.
Yeah.
Let's try to pull this together now. Look at the cross-cutting themes, the broader implications of this whole 25-year period.
Yeah, synthesizing this to see the patterns. The material highlights several recurring drivers. First, that fundamental tension we started with, sovereignty versus leveraging international institutions.
Right.
That's particularly acute with legal bodies, ICC, ICJ protocols, WTO appellate body and agreements seen as potentially dictating domestic policy like climate accords.
Then there's the recurring theme of economic nationalism and these fights over burden sharing. Who pays what?
Perceptions the U.S. contributes unfairly, that it's a burden, that regulations threaten U.S. industries comes up repeatedly. We saw it with WTO disputes, Paris critiques, GCF funding, WHO contribution arguments.
And the politicization of effectiveness or neutrality. Using that as a weapon, almost?
Yes, allegations of bias anti-Israel at UNHRC, UNESCO, anti-U.S. allies at ICC, or claims of ineffectiveness, WHO pandemic response, or being compromised, UNRWA. These are frequently used to undermine legitimacy and rationalize U.S. actions like withdrawal or defunding.
And it seems like so much of the unpredictability just tracks back to domestic partisan divides in the U.S., doesn't it?
The material makes it crystal clear. Stark policy reversals, WHO, Paris, UNFPA funding are directly tied to changes in administration, reflecting deep partisan polarization at home. This creates international instability, makes the U.S. appear unpredictable.
The sources also touch on the role of Congress and other domestic factors. It's not just the White House.
No, Congress plays a complex role, sometimes pushing back, preventing NATO withdrawal attempts via legislation, strong bipartisan support for the alliance, ensuring some UN funding despite administration cuts.
But sometimes driving disengagement too.
Imposing funding restrictions on UN bodies, passing laws prohibiting funding like with UNRWA. Public opinion shifts, influenced by events or media, and the rhetoric in domestic politics also shape the environment for U.S. engagement.
What's a really striking finding across all this, though, despite all the rhetoric and the specific cuts, is the persistent reality of U.S. funding levels.
This is a point highlighted. Despite critiques, withdrawals, freezes, the the U.S. has consistently remained the top contributor to all four major categories: WTO, WHO, NATO, the broader UN system throughout this entire 25-year period.
Really? Even with all the cuts?
The sources provide examples. Billions to the UN system, large share of NATO's common budget, historically significant WHO percentage, even recent WHO contributions over $700 million.
So there seems to be a kind of pragmatic limit to how much the U.S. actually withdraws or defunds in practice.
That's the implication drawn from the data. Specific programs can be targeted, yes, but complete disengagement from these major structures is costly, hard to sustain, and, as shown by the rapid Biden reversals, can be temporary. Fundamental U.S. interests in security, trade, stability are still served by these institutions, even amid disagreements.
Okay, so what are the broader implications for the international system, for the world, from this period of fluctuating U.S. engagement? What does it all mean?
The sources point to several key things. First, it contributes to weakening global governance structures. U.S. withdrawals, defunding, obstruction directly impact financial health, operational capacity, legitimacy. Think TUB-RCO RRWA funding challenges, the paralyzed WTO appellate body.
It also makes it harder to tackle the big global challenges, presumably.
Reduced or unpredictable U.S. participation hampers collective action on transnational issues: climate change, future pandemics, human rights, humanitarian crises. These need sustained collective effort.
And it seems to encourage others to maybe find different ways forward, potentially bypassing the U.S.
Yes, that's a key point. When the U.S. obstructs or withdraws, others are incentivized to create parallel structures. The WTO's MPIA, that interim appeal arrangement, is a direct example because the main body is blocked.
And the risk there.
It risks fragmenting the international order, could actually reduce U.S. influence in shaping future norms, potentially leaving the U.S. outside mechanisms others rely on.
And perhaps the most significant overall implication, the U.S. just becomes a less predictable global actor.
Policy instability. That back and forth we've seen across so many areas, it erodes U.S. credibility as a reliable, consistent partner. Other nations question the durability of U.S. commitments, making it harder to build the trust needed for long-term cooperation.
Let's just briefly compare the approaches of the different administrations based on what the sources highlight.
Under Bush, embraced trade, China WTO, used NATO post 9/11, push NATO expansion, but also tensions over Iraq, acting outside on NATO. Rejoined UNESCO, but skeptical of UNHRC, Bolton's unilateralist approach, ABM withdrawal. Kyoto repudiated,
Coupon.
shifted WTO focus to enforcement, challenged appellate body direction, repaired NATO ties, reassurance post-Crimea, pushed burden sharing. High tide of UN multilateral engagement rejoining bodies, climate health action, but domestic partisan links visible, Israel settlements abstention. Joined Paris, pledged GCF, more cooperative ICC stance, sharp break of WTO, paralyzed appellate body, unprecedentedly critical of NATO, obsolete, questioned Article 5, adversarial UN stance, America first. Withdrew from Paris first time, UNESCO, UNHRC first time, cut UNFPA, UNRWA, ICC sanctions, withdrew from INF, open skies, canceled GCF pledges.
And Biden signaled a clear return to engagement, but maybe not a simple return to the past.
Re-engaged WTO, but kept AB bloc, focused on reform China. Immediately reversed WHO withdrawal, restored funding. Revitalized NATO post-Ukraine, increased U.S. presence, championed Finland-Sweden entry. Immediately rejoined Paris, pledged GCF, though later rescinded by Trump 2025. Rejoined UNESCO, restored some UNR1 FPA funding, but faced 2025 cuts prohibition. Lifted ICC sanctions but maintained jurisdiction objections, then faced the broad 2025 aid freezes USAID shutdown.
So the pendulum swung back under Biden, showing renewed commitment in many areas. But those early 2025 actions noted in the sources clearly show that the stability of this engagement remains highly susceptible to future political shifts, domestic agendas.
The future trajectory of the U.S. role remains the central question here.
So to sum up, we've traced this evolution of U.S. support for international institutions. From architect and consistent engagers in the early 2000s through periods of shifts, withdrawals, disruptions, landing in this pattern of back and forth, sometimes contradictory, policies more recently. What's clear is the relationship is constantly being renegotiated, redefined.
And the central takeaway from this period, highlighted in the sources, is the undeniable impact of U.S. leadership, or the lack of it. When the U.S. is engaged and supportive, these institutions can be powerful engines for cooperation.
But when it disengages?
When the U.S. disengages, obstructs, or signals unpredictability, these institutions struggle. This evolution vividly shows how deeply U.S. domestic politics, policy priorities, even ideology, reverberate globally, shaping the whole environment for international cooperation.
It really does. And that leaves us with a significant question to consider as you reflect. Given this documented pattern of changing U.S. engagement, often driven by domestic political cycles, can global institutions effectively tackle the huge, complex, long-term challenges of the 21st century: climate, pandemics, humanitarian crises, if the sustained, predictable commitment of a key player like the U.S. is perceived as uncertain, unreliable?
And conversely, what does that very instability in its international engagement mean for America's own long-term influence, its credibility, and ultimately its standing in the world?
Institutions don't die with headlines. They hollow out in silence, through delays, deadlocks, withheld dues, or rules ignored by the powerful. America hasn't abandoned the order it built, but it no longer protects it unconditionally. And when commitment is conditional, adversaries test the limits, and allies prepare for failure. In the next episode, we ask what comes next. If the old system falters, do rising powers want to replace it, or just rewrite the rules?
Please like and subscribe.